Even if you get treated, it is a waste. Those were the words my daughter-in-law spoke while I was still holding the folder that explained why I needed surgery. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. I was 69 years old, not 99. I was sitting at my own dining table, not lying in a hospital bed. And yet Amber looked at me as if my future had already been decided. My name is Patricia Morgan, and until that afternoon I believed there were certain things family members simply did not say out loud. The appointment with Dr. Rebecca Lewis had taken nearly 2 hours. She had been kind, patient, and honest. The procedure was important. Without it, my quality of life would continue to decline. With it, there was a very good chance I could regain my strength and continue living independently. The challenge was the cost. Even after insurance, the remaining expenses would be close to $40,000. I did not panic when I heard the number. I had spent my entire life solving problems. I raised my son alone after my husband passed away. I worked long hours, balanced budgets, and survived difficult years that would have broken many people. I believed this would simply be another challenge to overcome. That evening, David and Amber came over for dinner. I did not ask them for money. I did not expect them to solve anything. I only wanted to share the news and discuss my options. At first, the conversation remained calm. David listened quietly while I explained what the doctor had said. Amber sat across from me scrolling through her phone. Then I mentioned the estimated cost. She finally looked up. $40,000? She asked. I nodded. That is the estimate. She leaned back in her chair. That seems like a lot of money at your age. The room became very quiet. I waited for David to say something. He did not. Amber shrugged. I mean, even if you get treated, it is a waste. Her voice was casual, almost bored, as though she were discussing an appliance that was too expensive to repair. I felt something inside me go still. Not anger, not even sadness, just silence. I folded the paperwork and placed it neatly back inside the folder. Across the table, David stared down at his plate. Amber continued talking about expenses, retirement, and practical decisions. I barely heard the rest. After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen long after the dishes had been washed. The clock ticked softly above the refrigerator. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. I kept replaying her words in my mind, not because they were cruel. Cruelty can come from strangers. What troubled me was how easily she had said them, as if she had already measured the value of my life and reached a conclusion. 2 days later, a letter arrived from my insurance company. It should have answered several important questions about my treatment plan. Instead, it raised one, because someone had already opened it before I ever saw it. I noticed the envelope before I even picked it up from the mailbox. The flap had been tucked back in, not sealed. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people would overlook. But I had spent years sorting bills, insurance forms, and official documents. I knew the difference between a factory seal and an envelope that had already been opened. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. For several minutes I simply stared at it. Then I carefully removed the papers. The letter explained portions of my coverage, estimated costs, and several treatment options. Important information. Personal information. Information that should have been seen by me first. Yet somehow it had reached my hands already disturbed. I tried to convince myself there was a harmless explanation. Perhaps the mailing process had damaged it. Perhaps the adhesive had failed. But deep down I did not believe either possibility. The timing felt wrong. Too many small things had begun to feel wrong. That afternoon I called the insurance company to ask a few questions. The representative was polite and helpful. During the conversation she mentioned that someone had recently contacted them seeking clarification about my coverage details. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. Who contacted you? I asked. She apologized and explained that privacy rules prevented her from sharing specific information. Still, the comment lingered. In my mind, long after the call ended, someone had been asking questions about my treatment. Someone other than me. That evening I drove to the grocery store. As I pushed my cart through the aisles, I spotted Amber near the pharmacy section. She seemed surprised to see me. For a moment her expression changed before the familiar smile returned. We exchanged a few polite words. Then her eyes drifted toward the folder sticking out of my handbag. Still dealing with all those medical papers? she asked casually. I nodded. There seems to be a lot to sort through. She smiled again. At least you are being realistic about everything. The comment settled heavily between us. Realistic. It was the same tone she had used at my dining table. The same quiet certainty. Later that night I sat in my living room reviewing the insurance documents again. That was when I noticed something unusual. One page referenced an inquiry date from the previous week. The date caught my attention because it was 2 days before I had even received the initial treatment estimate from my doctor. I read the line 3 times. Then a fourth. Someone had shown interest in my coverage before I had shared any details with family. The realization sent a chill through me. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back inside the folder. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the house felt strangely still. I was no longer wondering whether something was wrong. I was beginning to wonder how long it had been happening. And the next conversation I overheard would make that question impossible to ignore. The conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon, completely by accident. I had stopped by David and Amber's house to drop off a casserole dish she had lent me several weeks earlier. Their car was in the driveway, so I assumed they were home. As I walked toward the front door, I heard voices coming through the slightly open kitchen window. I was not trying to listen. In fact, I almost knocked immediately. Then I heard my name. My hand froze in midair. If she goes through with it, there will not be much left afterward, Amber said. Her voice was calm, almost analytical. You do not know that, David replied. The surgery could help her. There was a pause. Then Amber sighed. That is not the point. Something in her tone made me step back from the door. I stood motionless beside a flower bed, feeling strangely invisible. What exactly is the point? David asked. For the first time I heard frustration in his voice. Amber lowered her voice, but I could still hear enough. We have been talking about moving for years. We need a larger house. We need financial stability. We need to think about our future. David did not answer immediately. My mother is not a financial plan, he finally said. The silence that followed felt heavy. I should have walked away. I know that. But sometimes a person reaches a moment when the truth matters more than comfort. Amber spoke again. I am being practical. Someone has to be. I stared at the kitchen window, unable to believe what I was hearing. Practical. The same word. The same justification. Everything seemed to return to practicality whenever my future was discussed. Not my health. Not my happiness. Not my recovery. Practicality. A few moments later I quietly returned to my car without knocking. The casserole dish remained on the passenger seat beside me as I drove home. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Yet surprisingly I did not cry. I did not feel angry either. I felt clear. For weeks I had been trying to understand Amber's behavior. I had searched for explanations. Stress. Worry. Misunderstanding. Now those possibilities seemed less convincing. That evening I sat at my dining table reviewing old documents, property records, insurance paperwork, savings statements, retirement accounts, everything I had spent decades building through careful planning and sacrifice. For the first time I looked at those papers differently, not because I feared losing them, because I realized other people might already be calculating their value. As the hours passed, another thought entered my mind. If Amber was so interested in my financial future, perhaps there were questions I should be asking about my own affairs. Questions I had delayed for too long. Shortly before midnight, I picked up the phone and left. A message for someone I had not spoken to in nearly 3 years. My attorney. The next morning his assistant called back. He had an opening the following Tuesday. What I learned during that meeting would change far more than a medical decision. It would change the future of my entire family. The meeting with my attorney took place on a rainy Tuesday morning. The sky was gray, and a steady drizzle covered the streets as I drove downtown. I had worked with Richard Coleman for nearly 20 years. He had handled my husband's estate, helped me update important documents after I became a widow, and guided me through several major decisions over the years. When I entered his office, he greeted me warmly and immediately noticed that something was troubling me. I spent the next hour explaining everything. The medical diagnosis, the insurance questions, the open envelope. The conversation I overheard outside David and Amber's house. Richard listened without interrupting. Occasionally he made notes, but mostly he watched me carefully. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Patricia," he said gently, "before we discuss future decisions, there is something you should review." He opened a file cabinet and retrieved a folder containing copies of documents from previous years. Together we began reviewing beneficiary designations, account structures, and estate planning records. Most of the information was exactly as I remembered. Then Richard paused on one page. "Do you recall requesting this change?" he asked. I looked down at the document. My stomach tightened immediately. Several years earlier, certain assets had been adjusted to simplify future administration. That part was familiar. What surprised me was a note attached to the file. According to office records, someone had called requesting information about potential inheritance timelines and asset distributions. The inquiry had not come from me. Who made the call? I asked. Richard adjusted his glasses and reviewed the record. The notes indicate a family member. He paused. Specifically Amber. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The office seemed unusually quiet. I stared at the document while 100 small memories passed through my mind. Questions Amber had asked over the years. Casual comments about property values. Remarks about retirement savings. At the time they seemed harmless. Now they felt different. Richard closed the folder. "I am not suggesting conclusions," he said carefully, "but I believe you should make decisions based on your own wishes, not assumptions other people may be making." I nodded slowly. That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. My own wishes. Somewhere along the way, the conversation about my future had become focused on everyone else's expectations. The surgery, the expenses, the estate, the inheritance. Yet very little attention had been given to what I actually wanted. When I returned home, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea and watched the rain move across the yard. For the first time in weeks I felt calm. Not because I had answers, because I finally understood the right question. The issue was no longer whether my treatment was worth the cost. The issue was whether I intended to keep living my life, according to someone else's calculations. Late that evening, I received a call from Dr. Lewis's office. There had been a development regarding my treatment options, and what she told me the next morning would change everything I believed about my chances of recovery. The next morning I arrived at Dr. Lewis's office expecting another discussion about costs, scheduling, and paperwork. Instead, she greeted me with a smile I had not seen before. After reviewing several updated reports, she explained that a newly approved treatment program could significantly reduce my out-of-pocket expenses. Additional funding sources had become available, and several portions of the procedure would now be covered differently than originally estimated. I sat there quietly while she outlined the details. By the time she finished, the amount I needed to pay had dropped dramatically. It was still a serious expense, but it was no longer the impossible obstacle it had seemed just days earlier. For the first time since receiving my diagnosis, I felt genuine hope. On the drive home, I found myself noticing things I had ignored for weeks. The bright autumn leaves along the roads, children playing in a park, the morning sunlight reflecting off store windows. My future no longer felt like a shrinking hallway. It felt open again. That afternoon I began organizing documents related to the treatment. As I sorted paperwork, I discovered something else. Several financial records showed that I had more flexibility than I originally believed. Years of careful saving had provided options. I had spent so much time worrying about preserving assets that I had almost forgotten why I accumulated them in the first place. Security, independence, choice. What good were those things if I refused to use them when they mattered most? A few days later, David stopped by unexpectedly. He looked tired. The circles under his eyes suggested he had not been sleeping well. We sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee. For several minutes neither of us mentioned Amber, the surgery, or the growing tension that had settled over the family. Eventually he broke the silence. "Mom, are you still planning to move forward with treatment?" I looked directly at him. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Good." That single word surprised me. It carried none of the hesitation I had expected, only relief. Then he told me something that stayed with me long after he left. I think I have spent too much time worrying about money and not enough time thinking about people. There was sadness in his voice. Regret too. Yet it felt genuine. Later that evening I reviewed my estate documents again. Not because I feared what might happen, because I wanted my plans to reflect my values. Family mattered. Compassion mattered. Personal responsibility mattered. Most of all, I wanted every future decision to come from gratitude rather than pressure. As I closed the folder and placed it back on the shelf, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Amber. The message was brief. She wanted to meet for lunch. She said there were things we needed to discuss. I stared at the screen for a long moment. After everything that had happened, the invitation felt unexpected. But something about the timing felt even more interesting. Because earlier, that same day, my attorney had finalized a series of updates that nobody in the family knew about yet. And I had a feeling that once those changes became public, several conversations were going to sound very different. Amber chose a small cafe on the edge of town. The place was quiet, with large windows overlooking a row of maple trees that had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. When I arrived, she was already seated at a corner table. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. For a moment she looked nervous, which was unusual. Amber had always carried herself with confidence. As I sat down, she offered a polite smile. We exchanged a few ordinary comments about the weather before the real conversation began. "How are you feeling?" she asked. The question sounded sincere, but something about it felt rehearsed. "Better," I replied. "The doctors are optimistic." A brief shadow crossed her face before she quickly smiled again. "That is good news." We ordered lunch and spent several minutes discussing unimportant topics. Then Amber leaned forward slightly. "Have you thought about simplifying things?" she asked. "What things?" I said. "Your finances. Your property. Future planning." There it was again. The same pattern. Somehow every conversation eventually returned to the same subject. I stirred my iced tea slowly and watched her. "I have been reviewing everything carefully," I answered. Technically, it was the truth. Amber nodded. "That makes sense. These situations can become complicated." The word complicated lingered in the air between us. I noticed she seemed unusually interested in my treatment schedule, my financial obligations, and my long-term plans. Yet she asked very little about the procedure itself, very little about recovery, very little about how I felt. By the end of the meal, I understood something important. Amber was gathering information. The realization no longer hurt the way it once might have. Instead, it clarified things. When the check arrived, she insisted on paying. It was a small gesture, but it felt strangely symbolic. As we stood to leave, she hugged me lightly and said she hoped everything worked out. I smiled and thanked her. Then I drove home feeling calmer than I had in weeks. That evening, I met with Richard again. The updates to my estate plan were complete. We reviewed every document carefully. Several charitable organizations that had mattered deeply to me for years would now receive meaningful support. Educational funds had been established for future generations. Certain assets would be distributed according to values I believed in rather than assumptions others might make. When we finished, Richard closed the folder and smiled. "These decisions reflect who you are," he said. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in a very long time. The following week, Dr. Lewis confirmed my surgery date. Everything was moving forward. My health, my plans, my future. For the first time since receiving my diagnosis, I felt fully in control of my own story again. Then, 2 nights later, David called unexpectedly. His voice sounded strained. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think there is something you need to know." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. The seriousness in his tone immediately caught my attention. What he told me next would finally explain why Amber had been so interested in my future all along. David remained silent for several seconds after I answered the phone. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Finally he spoke. "Mom, I found something in Amber's laptop." I sat a little straighter in my chair. "What kind of something?" Another pause followed. "Financial projections." The words sounded strange coming from him. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Spreadsheets, notes, plans." His voice carried a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. She created documents estimating future expenses, property values, retirement accounts, and possible inheritance scenarios. I stared at the kitchen wall while he spoke. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in my backyard. Inside, everything felt still. "David," I said carefully, "people make financial plans all the time." "I know," he replied. "That is not the problem." Then he explained what had disturbed him. According to the files, Amber had organized multiple scenarios based on different outcomes. Some included my recovery and continued independence. Others assumed I would eventually move into assisted living. Several projected future property transfers. One document contained detailed calculations stretching years into the future. None of those things were illegal. None of them were even necessarily wrong. Yet the timing and focus left David deeply unsettled. "The strange part," he said quietly, "is how often your medical situation appears in those projections." I closed my eyes for a moment. Suddenly many conversations made more sense. The questions, the interest in paperwork, the concern about costs, it all fit together. "What did Amber say when you asked her about it?" I finally asked. David exhaled heavily. "She said she was planning responsibly. She said she wanted security." I could hear the conflict in his voice. Part of him wanted to defend his wife. Another part could no longer ignore what he was seeing. After we ended the call, I sat alone for a long time. Surprisingly, I did not feel angry. I felt sad. Not because someone had considered financial possibilities. Because somewhere along the way, practical calculations had begun to overshadow human relationships. The next week passed quickly. My surgery date approached. Friends called. Neighbors stopped by. Several people offered help without being asked. Their kindness reminded me that support often arrives from unexpected places. Meanwhile, Richard finalized every remaining legal document. Everything was complete. Every decision reflected my own wishes. Every plan reflected my own values. The sense of relief was enormous. One afternoon, as I left a follow-up appointment with Dr. Lewis, my phone buzzed with a message from David. "Family dinner Sunday. Everyone will be there. We need to talk." I read the message twice. Something about it felt significant. Not dramatic. Not hostile. Significant. By then my treatment plan was in place, my future was secure, and my decisions were finalized. For the first time in months, I felt ready for whatever conversation awaited. What nobody around that dinner table realized was that the choices I had made over the previous weeks were about to reshape every expectation they thought they could count on. Sunday dinner took place at David and Amber's house. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. Family photographs lined the walls. Candles flickered softly at the center of the table. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air. From the outside, everything appeared normal. Yet beneath the polite conversation, everyone seemed aware that something important was about to happen. David was unusually quiet. Amber smiled often, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. I arrived carrying a small folder. Nobody paid much attention to it at first. We ate dinner, discussed ordinary topics, and moved through the meal with careful politeness. Finally, after dessert plates had been cleared away, David set down his coffee cup and looked around the table. "There are a few things we need to discuss," he said. The room immediately became silent. Amber shifted slightly in her chair. I remained calm. David spoke first. He explained that recent events had forced him to reconsider several assumptions. He talked about family, trust, priorities. Then he admitted that he had spent too much time focusing on financial plans and not enough time appreciating the people around him. His words were sincere. For the first time in months, I could see genuine clarity in his expression. Amber listened without interrupting. Then David turned toward me. "Mom, I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air. "I should have supported you sooner. I should have listened more carefully." I nodded gently. There was no anger left in me, only understanding. After a few moments, I opened the folder I had brought with me. Inside were copies of several documents. Not because I wanted to shock anyone, because transparency matters. I explained that my treatment was fully scheduled. My recovery plan was in place. My financial affairs had been reviewed and updated. Everything had been organized according to my own wishes. Amber's expression changed slightly. She remained polite, but I noticed her attention sharpen. Then I continued. I explained that portions of my estate would now support educational programs, community organizations, and charitable causes that had been important to me for many years. Additional provisions had been created to help future generations pursue opportunities and education. The room remained completely quiet. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. I simply explained my decisions. When I finished, David smiled softly. "That sounds exactly like something you would do," he said. His words meant more to me than he probably realized. Amber lowered her eyes toward the table. For once, she seemed to have no prepared response. The future she may have imagined was no longer relevant. The future that mattered was the one I had chosen for myself. As the evening came to an end, I looked around the room and felt something unexpected. Peace. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Peace. Because my life was no longer being measured by projections, estimates, or assumptions. It was being guided by purpose. As I drove home beneath the glow of streetlights, I realized the most important decision I had made was not about money, property, or paperwork. It was choosing to believe that my future still belonged to me. And within days, I would receive news that proved just how right that decision had been. 2 weeks later, I woke up in my own bed and opened the curtains to a bright winter morning. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, and for a moment I simply stood there, appreciating something I had taken for granted for far too long. I felt stronger. Not perfect. Not fully recovered. But stronger. The surgery had gone well. Dr. Lewis had been right to remain optimistic. Recovery required patience, physical therapy, and determination, but every week brought progress. Every week reminded me that my future had not been decided by anyone else's expectations. During those first days at home, friends visited with homemade meals and flowers. Neighbors checked in regularly. David stopped by often. Sometimes he helped with groceries. Sometimes he simply sat with me and talked. Slowly, the distance that had formed between us began to disappear. One afternoon, several weeks after the surgery, he arrived carrying a photo album. We spent hours looking through old family pictures. Childhood birthdays. School. Graduations. Summer vacations. Memories from a life that suddenly felt very precious. At one point, David closed the album and looked at me. "I almost forgot how much you sacrificed for me," he said quietly. I smiled. "Parents are supposed to sacrifice." He shook his head. "Maybe. But children are supposed to remember." Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. We did not need to. Some lessons arrive late, but they still matter. Amber remained polite whenever we interacted, but something had changed. The calculations, assumptions, and conversations about practical outcomes had disappeared. In their place was distance. Not hostility, just distance. I accepted that. Not every relationship returns to what it once was. Sometimes the healthiest outcome is simply clarity. As winter turned toward spring, I attended a community event hosted by one of the organizations included in my updated plans. Watching young students receive support for educational opportunities filled me with a sense of purpose I had not expected. For years I believed my legacy would be measured by what I left behind. Now I understood something different. Legacy is measured by what you help create. Months after the surgery, I returned to Dr. Lewis for a follow-up appointment. She reviewed the latest results and smiled. "You are doing remarkably well," she said. Walking back to my car, I thought about everything that had happened. The diagnosis, the fear, the paperwork, the conversations that revealed more than people intended, the difficult truths, the painful realizations. Yet none of those things defined the ending. The ending belonged to me. That evening I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. A cool breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed. Life continued. Beautifully. Unexpectedly. I thought back to the moment when someone had suggested that investing in my future was pointless. Looking across the yard, feeling stronger with each passing day, I finally understood how wrong that idea had been. The treatment was not a waste. The recovery was not a waste. The years ahead were not a waste. Because the true Value of a life cannot be measured by age, money, or projections. It is measured by the courage to keep living it.